Hello everyone, and welcome to our next module. And in this module, as I said last time, we're going to be looking again at utilitarianism as an ethical system. But instead of looking at the founder, John Stuart Mill, we're going to be looking at the foremost utilitarian working and writing today, who is Peter Singer, professor of philosophy at Princeton University. This module will be a bit shorter than usual, given the Thanksgiving holiday, so hopefully you won't mind being deprived of a little bit of lecture time. But I did want to make sure that we talked about Singer a little bit in order to round out our introduction to utilitarianism, give you some examples of how it works, in order to prepare us going into the last part of the course, which is going to focus specifically on the vices, and we're going to be talking about some practical ethical choices. And so I think it's important to understand how utilitarianism works in practice, because it's really one of the, as I said last time, the primary ethical systems that people follow today. So Singer will give us a little more contemporary kind of utilitarianism and hopefully give you a better understanding of how it would work in real life modern situations, so that you can then use that in the last part of the course. So with all of that introductory talk out of the way, let's go ahead now and get started on our short Thanksgiving module. Now, to start off our discussion, I wanted to just tell you a little bit more about who Peter Singer is. And part of the reason for doing this is that when you go to read the chapter by Peter Singer I'm going to post for you, there are a lot of people who have quite negative reaction, I think it's safe to say, to the ideas that he puts forward in that particular work. And a lot of people might get the impression that he's some sort of crazy radical, or somebody who's really kind of on the fringes of modern philosophy and modern ethics. But really that is not the case at all. As I mentioned before, Singer teaches at Princeton, which is obviously one of the most prestigious universities in the nation and in the world. He is been cited by non-philosophers as really one of the foremost ethicists in the world today. Time magazine named him one of the most 100 influential people in the world. He's often interviewed for news programs or documentaries or things like that. And he's really one of the foremost philosophers, really, in terms of the media living today. He's written a host of books and articles on a wide range of topics, but all dealing with ethics. And yeah, as I mentioned, he frequently speaks and lectures and debates, often debates with Christian thinkers on a variety of issues. And I will also put up on Blackboard an interview with him that I found a while back, which was helpful as well in getting a better sense of who he is. So you could watch that along with this in the reading if you would like to get a better sense of what Peter Singer is all about. But suffice it to say, he is very influential. And one of the reasons that we are using him in this class, and one of the reasons I think that he is so influential and so often referred to, is that he is really remarkably consistent in his positions. He is a committed utilitarian and a preference utilitarian, which I'll explain in just a moment. But really what makes him stand out is that he really takes the ideas and follows them through to their logical end. And in a lot of ways, he's, I would argue, similar to Nietzsche in this regard. Nietzsche says some pretty outrageous things, but I think regardless of whether or not we would agree with his positions, one of the things that Nietzsche does, I think, is to demonstrate what happens once we get rid of the idea of a God or the idea of any sort of objective moral standard in the world, with God or not. And in that situation, Nietzsche's reaction of promoting the will to power seems to follow, and his rejection of traditional Christian ethics like humility or compassion. And Singer, I think, does a similar thing in developing his ethical system, that once you accept the premises of his preference utilitarianism, all of his positions that we're going to talk about here, I think, follow more or less naturally and logically from that foundation. And so he really does a nice job, I think, of demonstrating what utilitarianism looks like, at least in one form, if it's very consistently worked out and followed. Now, to talk about that particular form of utilitarianism, we can turn now to the next page. So I've said a couple of times now that Peter Singer is a preference utilitarian. And so we need to take a moment to talk about what precisely that means. And obviously it's a particular kind of utilitarianism, so it still is based on the general idea that we determine the morality of an action or of a choice by looking at its consequences. So this is, again, very different from, say, Aristotle's virtue ethics or natural law. It's not the impact on our character or whether an action fits with our nature that determines whether something's right or wrong. What determines whether something is right or wrong are the consequences that it produces. Right? So obviously with a consequentialist ethical system like this, the ends can and do justify the means to reverse the typical cliche that you often hear. And in this particular case, it's a form of utilitarianism, right? So the consequences that matter are going to be basically pleasure and pain. But here's where preference utilitarianism becomes distinctive. It's not really focused on pleasure or pain in the general sense, or in the kind of raw physical sensation sense that we find, say, in Bentham and the original kind of modern utilitarian philosophy, or even in a slightly more developed version in Mill. Preference utilitarianism says we're not focused just on feelings of pleasure and pain. What really matters and what we really need to look at in terms of whether or not an action accomplishes this or not are the preferences of the agents involved fulfilled, or are they not fulfilled or thwarted, right? So instead of just saying, does this produce the most pleasure possible, we will ask, well, does this action fulfill the preferences of as many people involved as possible, and does it minimize the thwarting of people's preferences or desires as much as possible. So it's obviously similar to utilitarianism, but it shifts it just from this feeling of pleasure and pain to are people's desires, are their preferences fulfilled? That's what really we should be aiming at, and that's what really matters in terms of determining the morality of a particular action or a particular choice. And with preference utilitarianism, there's going to be a range of different preferences to take into account. And here there is a similarity to Mill's distinction between higher and lower pleasures. In Singer's account, the most important consequences, the most important thing to try to maximize are the rational preferences of individuals, right? So if you have an individual rational agent, right, that's somebody who can reason through and think about their goals and desires, and if they have a significant long-term goal that they're aiming to accomplish, fulfilling that kind of preference is the most valuable thing in terms of Singer's moral system. So what we should ultimately and primarily aim at is fulfilling the rational, freely chosen preferences of agents. And in particular, when we're limiting ourselves to really focusing on rational preferences, that essentially means we are really going to focus on the desires, the wishes of adult human beings, but also older children But it's not going to include, say, for example, adults who are unconscious or adults who have diminished reasoning capabilities. Their preferences are not going to be as valuable. The most valuable preferences are going to be, again, those freely chosen rational desires of reasoning agents, i.e., rational adults or rational older children. Now, there are also, of course, preferences of a lower level, right? So pretty much every living animal has a preference to avoid pain, a preference to continuous life, a preference to experience pleasure, and of course there would be also maybe some slightly more sophisticated preferences among, say, young children or highly social animals. You might have apes that prefer to be with their friends and family, so to speak. There might be preferences of a similar nature in young children or other kinds of the higher animals that would be more sophisticated than, say, simply the desire to eat that you might find in an insect, but certainly less rational, less thought out than the long-term goals of a rational adult human being. So what we want to do is to maximize the overall fulfillment of preferences, which is going to include not just every person affected by a choice, but every living agent, right? So we're going to include animals, which can feel pleasure and pain, and on that level have preferences in Singer's system, just like infants or children would have. So we're going to include all of the living beings affected by an action, and we're going to try to maximize the fulfillment of their preferences. But again, greater value is going to be given to the preferences of rational, freely choosing individuals. Now, why is it that this form of utilitarianism was developed? And it wasn't originally developed by Singer. There were other utilitarians prior to him who developed this idea of preference utilitarianism. But one of the primary advantages of this is that it allows for a variation in what matters and what is ultimately valuable for different individuals. And of course, one of the big problems in utilitarianism is trying to determine, how pleasures are experienced across a wide range of people. And it seems to be a simple fact of experience that different people find different things pleasurable and to different degrees. I might enjoy opera every once in a while, but in terms of Mill's view, I may not really have the higher preferences that he would see as recognizing the ultimate value of opera over and against, say, football. I might much prefer watching football to going to an opera. But preference utilitarianism gets us past that kind of elitism that many people see in Mill. There is no objective standard that says opera is more valuable than football. Instead, we're supposed to try to promote the preferences of everyone. So if my preference is football, then that's good for me, and if your preference is opera, that's good for you. And there does seem to be a certain logic in approaching utilitarianism this way. Now, one of the big criticisms that could be leveled against this form of utilitarianism is that it seems like people could and do have some irrational preferences. Right? There are people who prefer to do things that harm themselves. There are people who prefer to do really trivial things. It seems like you could prefer to do something that would really not be to your benefit, would really cause you a great deal of pain and really not much pleasure. But if we adopt preference utilitarianism, there doesn't seem to be any reason to argue that following through with those actions, following through those desires, is in fact wrong. If preference utilitarianism is accepted, it seems to conclude that whatever a person's preferences are, they ought to be followed and valued just like anyone else's preferences. So that seems to present a real problem. And of course, we could try to defend it if we were preference utilitarians and say, well, look, some choices are crazy or are the result of an actual mental illness, and we're going to eliminate those. The problem is that once we introduce some standard to judge preferences by, then we've sort of undercut the basic foundation of our position, that it is ultimately people's preferences that matter most. So if there's some other objective standard that we can critique those preferences with, it seems we've gotten away from the foundation of our ethical system in the first place. But we could talk about those problems or issues as we proceed and as we discuss it on Blackboard. But for now, that's a basic introduction to what preference utilitarianism is. And what I want to do next is walk you through how Singer applies this to a range of different issues in his work. Now, in the reading I'm giving you, we're going to be focusing on Singer's medical ethics. And it's really there and in a couple other areas where he's received the most attention and notoriety in some circles. But I do think it's important to explain kind of the larger context of how he applies his preference utilitarianism. He's really known for his work on a handful of issues. One of them that receives a lot of attention by Singer is issues of money and poverty. And Singer is a very outspoken proponent of redistributing a great deal of the wealth in the modern world. And basically, again, this follows from his preference utilitarian arguments. He's going to say, for many people in the Western world who have quite a bit of money, look, moving from, say, $100,000 to $200,000, it really does not significantly change the preferences that this person can fulfill. Maybe you're upgrading from the mid-level boat to a upper middle level boat, but really that's not a significant advantage in terms of fulfilling preferences. The other issue, of course, is that with that $100,000 that you've devoted to, say, upgrading your boat property, you have maybe slightly more fulfilled one preference, but it's a preference of basically one individual. Right now, he's going to say, look, if we could take that $100,000 and use it in the third world, we could fulfill very important central preferences of many, many people. Right, that $100,000 might supply clean water or sanitation to an entire village. And obviously, then, if we are going to approach this from the aspect of preference utilitarianism, and we're going to consider the impact on the preferences of everyone who could be affected by an action, well, then, look, the morally correct course of action in terms of how to use that $100,000 is to give it to people in the third world. And so basically, along those lines, Singer argues that there should be a really significant shift in the world's money from the rich to the poor. And now, in terms of kind of practical ways of going about this, he advocates more modest approaches, say taking 5 or 10% from the wealthy and giving it to the poor. There's different details of the policy, but he does devote a great deal of time to making that basic argument that we have a moral obligation to shift much of our resources to fulfilling the preferences of many, many people who could receive a great deal of utilitarian benefit from this money that's being used to satisfy the more trivial preferences of a very few handful of people. So that's one big issue that he focuses on. Another one, and perhaps one he's even more famous for, perhaps most famous for amongst his positions, is his advocacy for animal rights. Now, as I mentioned, he sees the rational preferences as being the most valuable type. And obviously, when we're looking at animals like pigs or chickens, they're certainly not rational in anything like the way that the typical adult human being is rational. However, while those rational preferences might be the most valuable, they're not the only ones that we consider. And so Singer argues that, yes, we do fulfill a preference, a human preference for eating meat or eating eggs, and there is value in fulfilling that preference, but we need to balance that with the lower level preferences of the animals. But if we have a much greater number of animals suffering and having their preferences for avoiding pain, their preferences for living in accord with their nature, if those preferences are being thwarted for a vast number of animals to fulfill the preferences of a relatively small number of people, then he's going to see that as an immoral situation. If I want to eat chicken for the year, this is going to require a significant number of chickens to, at least in the modern agricultural system, to be treated typically very poorly, to suffer a great deal, to never be able to do many of the things that chickens want to do given their nature. So that's a great deal of suffering over and against my preference for eating chicken. And it's not as if I eat the chicken or starve. Instead, I could eat other things that would not require those chickens to suffer. So it's a relatively trivial preference on my part over and against significant suffering of a large number of animals. So Singer has argued for many years now, and really kind of before animal rights became a popular cause that all the celebrities line up for. Singer was arguing for animal rights long before most of them. And basically, again, given his preference for utilitarianism, he sees it as just the morally correct thing to do. So that's another big thing that he focuses on. Now, as you'll see in the article, he's often criticized for basically saying that there's no qualitative difference. There's nothing unique about human beings that separates them from other animals. As far as he's concerned, there's just a continuum of animal life. And as it turns out, human beings have the greatest intellectual capacity of animals that we know of, which means that their preferences are more valuable. But there's not a clear break between human beings and all other creatures. He's going to say, look, there are some human beings who have very little rational capacity, newborns or the severely disabled. And in fact, there are some animals that have more intellectual ability than some humans. So some higher apes, for example, would have more intellectual capacity than the severely disabled or even than normal infants. And so he then places the kind of moral value or the preferences value of those higher animals higher than he would place the value of the disabled or infant human beings. But we'll get to that more in a moment. The last thing I wanted to mention, of course, is he also is very well known for his positions on different medical ethics issues, including abortion, euthanasia, the care for the terminally ill. So he's written a great deal on medical ethics, and we will talk now on the next page in some more detail about specifically what he argues for in the area of medical ethics. Okay, so getting now specifically to the area of medical ethics, which is what the reading is going to focus on, let's introduce you briefly to Singer's basic positions that he's going to elaborate on in your reading. As I mentioned on the previous page, for Singer, human life does not have any intrinsic value per se. Right? It's just by being a living human being, Homo sapien, that does not give you any particular moral value given Singer's position. He is a preference utilitarian. So all that matters is the fulfillment of preferences. So if a person lacks the capacity for forming freely chosen rational preferences, then they are going to have correspondingly less moral value. Or if a person does have the ability to form rational preferences, but they prefer to die rather than to live, then we have to value that preference, just like we value all other preferences. And so this is going to produce a medical ethics, or a system of medical ethics, that is very different than many other medical ethics systems out there, and certainly very different than, say, traditional Christian values in terms of medical ethics. So to put this another way, one of the things that you'll really notice in this reading is that as far as Singer is concerned, what really has value when we're making decisions in the medical field is a life wanted or not? Right? So if there's a rational preference for a given life, that means it has value. If there is not a preference for that life to continue, then that life really does not have any significant value. And in fact, if there is pain being experienced in that life, it might have really kind of a negative ethical value, and we might have even a moral obligation to terminate that life. So again, you'll see yourself how Singer works this out, but it's going to produce some results that will be fairly surprising for many people. For example, right, when it comes to the severely disabled, Singer basically says that we don't have any obligation to support people who are severely disabled. And given his general view, he doesn't necessarily come out explicitly and say that we ought to euthanize the severely disabled, but it seems to follow from the logic of his position. If we have somebody who has no rational preference to continue living, and we have a lot of people who have to devote a lot of time and effort to that person's care, and that time and effort could be devoted to fulfilling the rational preferences of people who do have rational preferences, well then it seems that we would even have a moral obligation to work to maximize the fulfillment of those preferences of others by taking our resources away from a person who, in Singer's system, has no real moral value. In terms of practical consequences, again, you can read this for yourself, but this is going to mean that euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide should certainly be permitted, and in fact should maybe even be encouraged. That if a person's preference is to die, then in Singer's system, then we ought to try to fulfill that preference. With abortion, again, he's going to argue that if there's a rational preference that this pregnancy not continue on the part of the mother, obviously a fetus or an unborn child does not have rational preferences. Therefore, the course of action we should pursue is the termination of the pregnancy. And particularly if it is someone who, if the child is going to be disabled, this makes it, again, not just a question of choice, but you get the clear impression from Singer that there comes close to being almost a moral obligation to terminate pregnancy if a person is going to be disabled, because they're never really going to have the kind of rational preference value that Singer is focused on, and we would be better off devoting our time and resources to those people who could have rational preferences to fulfill. And then lastly, and perhaps what will probably strike most of you as the most surprising aspect of the work, is that Singer argues that infanticide should in fact be permitted for a fairly lengthy period of time. I've read a number of his works. I don't recall specifically what time span he gives in this chapter. He's varied over the course of the years how long he thinks you should be able to have to kill an infant. But again, following his logic, he argues that young infants don't really have rational preferences, and so if there are preferences on the part of the parents to not be burdened with caring for the child, then it would be moral for them to kill the child, although of course they should do it in as painless a way as possible to avoid inflicting pain, which again, even primitive animal life has a preference of not experiencing pain. Now, obviously we could say a great deal about his arguments for infanticide and for a number of the other issues raised in the reading, but we can do that on the discussion board. So what I want to do lastly before we go to the questions is to just compare this position quickly to some of the other ethical systems that we've looked at as a way to help us wrap up this overview of ethics that we've done in the first half of the course. Now, obviously, many books have been written comparing the different ethical systems and ethical thinkers that we've been looking at in this course. So really all we can do here is a very abbreviated comparison. But I thought it would be helpful to contrast Singer with some of the other figures that we've looked at, just to give us a better sense of the overall picture of things. If we compare Singer and his positions to, say, Aristotle, I think there are some key differences. And in Singer's system, really what we ought primarily to do is fulfill our desires, right? So if I have a preference for living a child-free lifestyle, and it turns out that I'm expecting a child, or my wife, as the case may be, well then look, fulfilling my preference is what matters, so I will terminate the child, or even if I had the child and decide it's just too much work and I don't want to continue with it, I can kill the child even after it's born. So really it's all about fulfilling my desires. That's the ultimate goal in life. That's the ultimate determining factor of what we should or shouldn't do. For Aristotle, I think you get really kind of the opposite approach to things in many ways, right? Aristotle's virtue ethics is going to say the goal of life is not to be able to do whatever it is I want to do, right? For Aristotle, the goal of life is to develop our character so that it is, in fact, truly excellent, and that we've studied human nature, we've looked at other people, we've learned about tradition and what has been defined as human excellence throughout history, and we work and we make hard choices against, oftentimes, our desire for pleasure or our desire to avoid pain, in order that we can shape our desires to match a certain pattern of excellence. So for Aristotle, the idea that we would begin our moral life and conduct our moral life by simply acting on what we prefer would strike him as ridiculous. Now look, once you have formed your character, once you have formed your virtues, then acting morally will in fact be just that. You will want to do the moral thing, and it will come naturally to you. But you only get to that point by spending a long period working to develop your character so that your preferences are in fact in line with what is really good, what is really virtuous, what is really excellent. And so I think he would see Singer as essentially a deeply flawed and sort of backwards way of thinking about the moral life. If we compare Singer to natural law, again, there's going to be a very sharp contrast between them. Natural law is going to say, look, our preferences will often be to do things that are good, but they can also be to do things that are bad. We determine what we should and shouldn't do not by thinking about what is it that I want to do. Instead, we study human nature. We learn about what's really good for it, what succeeds, and then we try to live in a way that matches that. And again, over time, we will naturally do what is right. But simply what I desire to do does not determine what's right or wrong. What determines what's right or wrong is a proper understanding of human nature, which is often going to ask me to really change what it is that I desire or what I want. Now, if we look at Singer and compare him to, say, Hume or Nietzsche, obviously there's going to be differences. But I think there is also a lot of commonality. And in fact, I think you could see Singer as one expression of the tradition that goes back through Hume and Nietzsche. Once we get rid of standard, objective morality, again, as we talked about with Mill, what can we find that people can agree on? Well, there's pleasure and pain, but again, that too seems like we can't really be certain of what's pleasure and pain for everybody, so we can have preference utilitarianism, which in many ways simply says do what you find pleasant and avoid what you find unpleasant. So again, very reminiscent of Hume, and also certainly has, I think, some correspondence with what Nietzsche would advocate as well. If there is no standard of morality out there, if there is no God, then we ought simply to assert our own will. Now, Singer would not advocate this kind of self-centered assertion of will like we would find in Nietzsche. He's going to argue that we ought to consider the impact of our actions on everyone. But this locating of moral value in the will, in the personal preferences and choices of individuals, that is, I think, a common link between the two figures. So I think in many ways, Singer represents kind of one of the prime expressions of modern ethical theories that follow from philosophical skepticism, and he really contrasts with and shows the contrast between modern ethical systems and the traditional ethics that we find in Aristotle or in natural law. Well, that's enough for the comparison for now. So I just wanted to end then with a few questions for you to consider about Singer and the reading. So, hopefully you've watched this now, and take some time to read Singer for yourself. And then I'd like for us to discuss these questions on Blackboard. First off is just what's your general reaction to Singer and to the piece? And again, obviously you can kind of say if you thought it was horrible or if you thought it was wonderful, but go into a little more detail about what you thought of it in terms of your overall response to it, assessment of it. Then more specifically, what do you think is the strongest point in the work? Is there a point that he makes that's particularly convincing, particularly powerful? Or even if you disagree with him, is there something where you can see how his argument would be persuasive to many people? And then, of course, what about the opposite? Is there something that strikes you as particularly weak, particularly problematic? whether you agree with him or not. And then finally, what I would like you to consider to wrap up the questions here is this work obviously focuses on medical ethics, but we've talked a little bit about preference utilitarianism in general, and you've seen how it would apply in the realm of medical ethics. So what I'd like you to do is to think about what would adopting preference utilitarianism mean in terms of our everyday life. So most days we're not going to be forced with whether or not to take someone off life support or whether or not to terminate a child with Down syndrome. How might it affect our kind of more everyday choices if we were to adopt Singer's form of utilitarianism? Would it not really change anything? Would it make some particular changes, big changes in all parts of our lives? So just think about that and then give me your best guess, your best thoughts about how it might really impact you on a day-to-day basis. And of course, feel free to include any other questions or comments you might have, and I look forward to reading your thoughts on Singer.